general session. So let's jump right in. It's my privilege to introduce Kelly Sellers, President, Center Director of Impact Washington. We'll introduce our speakers. It says here Impact Washington. So that is a expanded value sponsor. Introduce myself. We don't do Washington. So please welcome. Welcome.
I am delighted to be here with my associate colleagues, Wells, and Impact Washington is pleased to be a WEDA sponsor and to be able to be part of that week in WEDA. It's important work to grow jobs and increase economic vitality across all the state. Impact Washington's vision is to advance manufacturing workforce excellence in Washington State. Our vision was developed based on the understanding that in order for our state to have a robust and forward-thinking manufacturing community, our role would be concentrated on providing solutions and trading directly to companies and the workforce within these companies. We could not do this work home manufacturers thrive without you our partners and teams. So thank you very much. It's my honor to introduce two friends of WEDA and the economic development community, our featured speakers, Dr. Annalise Sherman and Dr. Ron. Dr. Van Sherman is the Chief Labor Economist for the Washington State Employment Security Department. Prior to this role, she served as a regional economist for 13 years, covering the local labor markets in Northwest Washington and the Seattle area. As many of us can attest, Annalise works closely with economic and workforce development and others to provide labor market intelligence to inform. Dr. Van Sherman PhD in economic geography and master's degree in economics, both from the State University of New York. Dr. Ron is a professor in economics in the School of Business at University of Sweden. She specializes in international trade, economic development, and finance. Dr. Kaiser also owns an independent research firm, Brave for Analytics, which conducts analysis, studies, and expanding from economic initiatives. Dr. Washington, you are vitality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Annalise Sherman
Thank you for the introduction. Really quick advertisement to oversee original funds who are available as a resource to anybody in economic workforce development media, basically anybody who has use of labor. Please feel free to reach out to me to get in touch with the regional economists. Our information is also on the website. I'm going to present basically an overview of state economy with the lens, with the specific lens of the labor market. But as it's predicted in this presentation, one of the things that really occurs to me as we're thinking about the question of equity is one of the challenges that fundamentally face a lot of the data that we have access to, especially when you're into an presentation. So what you're going to see, you'll be seeing graphs really show kind of broad strokes, but we have the ability to get under the surface in some cases, whether it be for geographic reasons, and in some cases able to work to some of the demographics. So I will bring those in as I'm able to apply. But that's also where, again, advertising, please feel free to reach out to us. Where you tease out some of these nuances in the regional. So, first of all, just the overview, story of what we've been experienced in Washington State, which has been very similar to the nation. But when we look at, this is the number as far as our series of states in Washington State. What we can see is this pattern of overall predictability to a certain extent. Ways where we see demand and cost demand truly is where supply and demand meet eventually. But what we can see when we're looking at demand is it actually drops during recessions. We see this wave-like pattern for jobs, which does drop, and it comes back very until we get to 2020. 2020 was something completely different. Not only was the drop deeper, it was in 2 months. 2 months, we actually lost 430,000 jobs in Washington State. That took us back to about 6 years worth of job growth deleted in 2 months. But then what we see right after that has been a trend of extremely rapid growth. This recovery, looking at that pattern, very economists like patterns, take a lot of comfort in patterns, and see that kind of drop off this way to take. The answer is it took 2 years to get back to where 6 years worth of job loss recovery in 2 years. We figured out a lot of stuff. We figured out the science behind it, policy work, public sector, private sector, individuals, just a lot of innovation, a lot of rapidly adopting technology. We figured a lot of things out really quickly. At this point, what we're seeing a lot of is, I don't want to say stagnation, we're still growing. We're just not growing at 20%. We're back at 20%. So when we're growing at 1% year over year, it feels slower. Incidentally, the Economic American Forecast Council does predict that we're going to have about 1% growth continuing over the next few years. Looking at the other side, we're talking about the labor force. Of course, we're talking about supply and speed. And we have a little bit of a different pattern demand. Whereas during recessions, we actually saw that demand drop, the number of jobs drop. But you don't really see that same pattern when we're looking at people. We might see people expecting to be employed, straddle that line between being employed or being unemployed, or being actively seeking employment. But the generous decline, especially in a state like Washington, until we get to the recession, when we saw a very different pattern. We can just stay in the labor force, they were unemployed, though. This was a situation where this is what we saw. The legal labor force, we all have our own stories, we all know how complicated the situation was. People leaving the labor force because of health reasons, because of family health reasons, because of children being developed, educational reasons, a lot of reasons why people stepped out temporarily. And they've been stepping back in. I've been seeing labor force coming back. Actually, when we look at total labor force participation and seeing a continued decline, a lot of this having to do with the structure of our population. When we look nationally, we're actually seeing decline in labor force participation. We're coming back a bit, but the long-term trend going back to the early 2000s has been decline. And a lot of this is just the size of different generations. And as we have a lot of people retiring, we're seeing that overall labor force participation. Something we've been seeing coming for a very long time. One thing when I'm thinking especially about a lot of the issues that we're dealing with right now, absolutely not right. But we're also continuation of some. Although we're seeing a decline in labor force participation overall. Prime age labor force participation is recently hit record highs. So we've got a lot of different dynamics happening. So let's tease out a little bit what that looks like. The unemployment rate, again, it's not coming from the security department, not slide. Not the principal, I'm pretty sure. But what we have experienced is, again, it's really an unusual time period. We went through an unemployment rate down to the 15% range, and then plummeted down to some of the lowest unemployment rates out there. In Washington State, we saw 3.8% unemployment rate last September. July, August, and September. Lowest on record, sustained for 3 months in a row. It's been coming up. I'm hearing a lot of questions from the media. It's coming, unemployment rate is coming up. Are we heading into a recession? You see what it looks like. The unemployment rate coming up, historically speaking, is still very low. So overall, a lot of different dynamics happen relate to those two initial slides. We've got demand coming back, we've got a lot of jobs coming back very, very quickly. Supply, slowly. People took their time coming back to labor force, but they are, for the most part, we're talking about the prime age working about coming back. Still relatively small labor force compared to what we might have before. So what this means, of course, the unemployment rates are on accessibility, it's on being able to manage to work. Right now, if you're a job seeker, chances are compared to times when the unemployment is higher. Of course, we switch this over to look at businesses, and what we find is this is times difficult for businesses to attract the workers. We're hearing this in every conversation I'm having, I'm hearing about the challenges that employers are facing. And they are. They're competing with each other for scarce workers. But one of the things that I also see in some of these trends, a lot of the conversations I'm having, a lot of the are similar to what I was hearing in 2018. The also, and employers were scarce workers. Now, beneath the surface, of course, there's some variation when we look at geography as well as when we look at Washington State, you can see different geographic patterns depending on where you are. This is a pretty typical pattern. For most of our years, the ESD, we tend to see some of the same areas where our lowest unemployment rates, except during the apple harvest, tend to be in Long Island, usually in the Cadence and Orange Counties area, and this has been the case. This is the case now too. In fact, our unemployment rate is at least an hour and a half ago, 4.9% statewide. What this really reinforces for me when I'm looking at these slides now, and geography. This is accessibility. This is when we're thinking about jobs, and it helps to have job market in order to have low unemployment. It helps, but it's not completely efficient. It's really about how well people are connected to work. And this has a number of different equity issues tied to it. For what communities are, do the skills match the need in the communities? Are people able to find out? Are they able to connect to it? When we look at areas like Snohomish counties, where we tend to have that low unemployment rate, some of the things that characterize these counties is redundant transportation networks. If you can't get there by car, you can get there by bus or by train. Dense social networks. You're more likely to find out about the road through social networks. More broadband coverage. To be able to find out about a job online, apply for a job online, go to work online. So there are a lot of things that get tied in and show up beneath the surface of the unemployment rate. How that shows up in our communities. Do not try to read this, I will walk. But overall, the idea of this is that we have some different, when we bring that lens back, when we when you bring that lens of who is unemployed, there's not a whole lot of, well, labor force participation in that. We don't have a lot of detailed data at state level, but at the national level, we do. When we look at that unemployment rate, we see that there's consistently a gap between the unemployment rate depending on race. So the most recent measure from the Bureau of Labor Statistics had the overall unemployment rate. That's right. It's going to be in that top 4%. With 3.4% unemployment rate for whites, 2.5 for Asian, 4.5 for Hispanic, 6.4 for Latinos. So there's a gap, and it's a persistent gap. One of the things that we're noticing though, when we have these moments where unemployment is particularly low, and competition is harder for employers than workers, we tend to see that gap close. It is not closed all the way by any means. There's 4% gap between the lowest unemployment rates. But we do see that gap. One of the things that I'm encouraged by the Economic Performance Council is that they are expecting to see 4% range for quite a while, and that has to do with that demographic. So that gives me a little bit of hope. We might be in this moment where there is a sustained pressure and conversation around how do we more inclusively to think, write the ideal job candidate and the ideal job. So we are seeing some of that. Some of those gaps close. And history tells us that they will not get in recession, but generally speaking, low unemployment are moments to be really having that conversation. Looking at Washington State, we don't have a whole lot of detail, but I'm just going to move through these really quickly. To the left, we've got age. So that first kind of rounded category says labor force participation rate by age. What we can see is labor force participation rate by age. 16 to 19-year-olds have a low labor force participation rate. And that's good. We've got a lot of, and they, in many cases, haven't entered the workforce yet. Once we get into our 20s, labor force participation is about 80%. It stays there until it stays at 80% range until about late 50s. Looking at that second category, this is looking at different categories of race and ethnicity. You can see kind of a jagged line. Overall, very little difference in statistically or pulling margins of error. Very little difference. What it means is that regardless of race and ethnicity, human neighbors are equally likely to be participating in the labor force, either as an employed person or as an participating in the less when we look at gender, men are more likely to be a snapshot of labor force. Women's labor force participation rate is a little bit lower, is influenced by the presence of children. But then these next categories I think are really important because they do point to some of the evidence barriers as well. People with a disability are more likely to see. Okay, so that pair of lines, pair of bars towards the end, that's poverty. Below the poverty level, very low labor force participation rate compared to above the poverty level. Similarly, when we look at the reports of the Census Bureau for disability. So these are indicators to me of barriers. And finally, education. The more informal education we have, more likely you are any given snapshot of time to the labor force. The story switches a little bit. We take the subset of those in the labor force and look at the unemployment rates. Again, same categories when we go left to right. Age 16 to 19-year-olds have high unemployment rates. They're more likely to be looking for the first time or seasonal work. And then we see that unemployment rates tend to stay low through mid to late career. When we get to when we look at race and ethnicity, we absolutely see some divergences. With white, the lowest unemployment rates similar to the nation, white, Asian, Washington, about 3% unemployment rate. And when we look at Black African American and American Indian and Alaska Native, closer to 5 to 6%. So we do see some different experiences. They're equally likely to be in the labor force and more likely to be on. Looking at poverty, that's that line of the whole, I had to put the entire scale to fall under poverty, very high statistically. Disability as well, maybe more education you have, the less likely you are to make a snapshot together. I don't think I have time to go into JOLTS. Suffice to say, what JOLTS can tell us is about turnover, hires and separations. We are seeing, we'll just jump straight to the quits rate. We still are at a moment where we have an elevated quits rate. That's like quits rate is basically, there are two ways you can separate the job, either voluntarily or involuntarily. We're seeing the quits rate coming down slightly, still historically fairly high. What this means is that two things. One is job optimism. A lot of people are job switching, there are job opportunities out there. The other one is burnout. And I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge, especially. By comparison, layoff activity, that's that pretty low thought. Picking up a little bit, overall still relatively low. This is the Washington State. Job openings are very closely related to the quits rate. We are seeing job openings coming down in recent months, similar to the nation. However, if you look historically speaking, we're still in a moment of high job openings, and therefore we can expect to still continue to see turnover. Looking at some different turnover statistics that we have available to us in Washington, I explored before this presentation. The turnover rates by race and ethnicity, what we do see historically in any given snapshot is that Black, Indigenous, and Islander categories are more likely to have a lot of turnover compared to white Asian in our state. So there is this question of turnover and stability in the labor force, and we do have limited data, but some that does help to looking quickly at industries, we of course have very different experiences depending on which industry we're in Washington. Just a couple that we can jump point out really quickly. One is some of the industries that were covered fairly quickly. The one at the top there is the information sector. One that's very closely linked to that is professional services. These are industries that very quickly not barely even had to recover. They just had demand not only from they were able to sustain employment levels not only because they consider workers' health, but lots of people were sending workers home, benefiting from that technology. We do see that dip in the information sector recently, in the last year and a half. Some very high profile layoffs. Overall, that is sectors coming down. It's more or less leveled out at this point, but we are seeing some of that challenge. And then looking at the other end, some of the industries that have challenged coming back, and I'll just draw attention to leisure hospitality, which includes our restaurants, hotels, and sports venues, that fell about 40%, and only a couple months ago past that, reached the level that we've been. So a lot of different challenges. And then across the state, actually this has been a different trend than we've seen. Whereas a lot of our rural areas have had long recoveries from the Great Recession, usually we're some of the first to recover from the pandemic, largely because there's a greater proportion of industries and activities related to essential activities. And over to thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here in my hometown. I usually have to go to the west side for these presentations, so it's nice to be right in my backyard. I will be talking about the general economy. I'll provide a brief forecast of the U.S. economy and the Washington economy, now move right into talking about growth in development or economic empowerment as it relates to growth and development. So I'd like to let the cat right out of the bag in the beginning of my presentation. So I'll start with the key takeaways. The U.S. GDP, U.S. GDP growth is solid. The U.S. economy is growing at a healthy pace. The economic outlook remains uncertain. There are reasons for that I'll get into in a little bit here. The labor market, as Dr. Vice Chairman just talked about, it remains tight but continues to approach balance. Washington job growth has been stronger than expected, although we're projecting slower job gains as the economy slows down. Inflation remains elevated, as you all can feel when you go to the grocery store, and I've heard in the recent data that just came out. Although inflation is improving, Washington's inflation rate is above the nation's inflation rates, and the Federal Reserve is expected to hold the federal funds rate target at the 5.25% to 5.5%, given that inflation is still ticking up. And lastly, achieving economic empowerment means everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or social and economic background, should have the ability to meet their basic needs and achieve security. So I'll end with that. So in terms of the economic outlook, the positives are that, as I said, the U.S. continues to add jobs. The national employment in May increased by 272,000 jobs, so that's great. Washington's non-farm employment also increased by a little over 31,000 jobs since December. Data on consumer confidence is mixed. There are some that think that the economy is doing well and feel positive about the economy, but there are others that have a negative view of the economy, and that's based on perceptions about future business conditions, job availability, and incomes to inflation. The Federal Reserve has decided to pause interest rate increases. That's good news, but there is pressure for the Fed to lower interest rates as we're starting to see some macroeconomic instability in the commercial real estate market and housing affordability. The negatives, as I mentioned, relate to the hikes in interest rates and tighter credit that imposes vulnerability in the commercial real estate market, business investment, aggregate demand. We also have election uncertainty. I was just talking to someone right before this presentation. A lot of people are very nervous about the upcoming elections, also the war in Ukraine, Russia, Israel, and Hamas conflicts that all play into a negative or a feeling of uncertainty about future economic activity. In terms of GDP growth, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, their most recent report, real GDP increased at an annual rate of 1.3% in the first quarter of 2024. This growth is lower than the fourth quarter of 2023, where GDP increased by 3.4%. So we are starting to see a slower economic growth for the U.S. economy. The same thing, this is due to lower consumer spending, lower exports, and lower federal and state spending. There are many GDP forecasts out there that have already looked at projections, the projections of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank and leadership consensus GDP forecasts and other macroeconomic factors to derive my own economic forecast. I expect that GDP will continue to grow for about 1.9% in 2024, 1.8% in 2025, and in the longer range of the 2020 I expect it to grow between 1.6 and 2.5%. One thing to keep in mind is that historically GDP grows at an annual rate of 2 to 3%. So these forecasts is pretty much in line with normal economic growth. In other words, we're not expecting a recession per se. We are expecting sustained economic growth at a pretty much historical level. In terms of inflation, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, remained unchanged for May. That's good news. However, compared to May of 2023 last year, prices are up 3.3%. And so we, between last year and this year, continue to have inflation that's above the 2% target the Federal Reserve Bank likes to see. And so for Washington, we have the same, well, actually, we have a higher inflation rate. For the Seattle area, we've had an inflation rate of about 4.4% from a year ago. So that outpaces the nation's inflation rate, something to keep into perspective. And since inflation typically outpaces wage growth, that's what we call negative wage growth. I would like to highlight the title of this presentation, which is Sustained Economic Growth and Development Required Economic Empowerment. So, economic empowerment. The recent Harris poll for the Guardian shows that 55% of Americans believe the U.S. economy is shrinking. 56% think the U.S. is experiencing a recession, even though the economy is growing at a healthy rate. 49% of Americans believe the S&P 500 stock market index is down for the year, even though the index went up about 24% in 2023 and is up by more than 12% this year. 49% of Americans believe that the unemployment rate is at a 50-year high, even though the unemployment rate has been under 4%, which is a near 50-year low. So why do Americans feel like the U.S. economy is performing poorly? I would argue that the reason Americans feel the economy is bad is because they lack economic empowerment. The idea of economic empowerment complements the idea of a living wage. We've heard that phrase before, which is a concept that has gained traction for quite some time now. The idea of economic empowerment simply means that everyone, regardless of who they are, can consistently afford basic essentials such as food, shelter, education, and healthcare, and still be able to save for a rainy day. It means people can pursue their full potential without the barriers presented by a lack of access to basic goods and services. The economic empowerment framework promotes the replacement of the poverty line with an empowerment line. Right? So we currently talk about a poverty line. This framework proposes that we raise that poverty line so that it becomes an empowerment line. This is based on the premise that the poverty line defined by many countries is simply too low and needs to be raised. So the difference between living at the poverty line and the empowerment line is essentially the difference between surviving, that's the poverty line, and thriving, that's the empowerment line. So here are some examples. For example, so being at the poverty line means that you are eating enough calories to survive. Being at the empowerment line means that you're eating nutritious foods and to stay healthy. Being at the poverty line means having water. Being at the empowerment line means that you have clean water consistently. So it is a higher bar when it comes to having access to basic necessities. So here's some indicators of an inclusive economy, because an inclusive economy requires that we are empowered economically. And so an inclusive economy is a free market economy where all people can earn a living wage, they can start and grow a business, they can save money for a rainy day, they can demonstrate resilience in the face of unexpected shocks, they can plan for retirement, and they can have agency to shape their own future and pave the way for future generations. So here are some indicators of an inclusive economy. I'm going to focus on just a couple of them, and interest of time, so I will talk a little bit about the living wage, I will talk about education and housing. So the Massachusetts Institute of Technology has developed a regional living wage calculator. And the living wage shown is the hourly rate that an individual in a household must earn to support themselves or their families. They're working full time or 2,080 hours a week. This table provides living wage estimates for individuals in households with 1 or 2 working adults, and then the range goes from 0 to 3 children. I would like to highlight that 1 adult with no children, the living wage based on this calculator should be, living wage per hour should be $28.70 for an individual with no children, single working individual in the household. So I pulled some data from the Washington Employment Bureau, and this is for 2019. This is the most recent data I was able to pull, and please let me know if you have more recent data. So this table shows data on FTE employment by hourly wage. So according to the living wage calculator, as I said, 1 adult, 0 children should be making $28.70 per hour. As we can see here, 52% of Washingtonians in the state of Washington are making less than $28 an hour. And for Spokane, 64% of Spokaneites are making less than $28 an hour. So the conclusion here is that most people in our state are making less, are not making enough wage. And so when we look at these indicators of an inclusive economy, we can see that we are not right where we should be. So this is some education data, and we can see here, we look at the percentage of students enrolled in the first year after high school graduation, enrolled in some kind of certificate or college. 48% of kids in Washington are not enrolled in any program. And when we look at the highest degree attained within 8 years of high school graduation, we see that 56% of our youth does not have any kind of degree or certificate. And so as we can see here, and Annalise pointed this in our presentation, there is a positive correlation between your educational attainment and your wage. And so with those having some kind of education, having a higher wage. And we see the same patterns for housing. We have a lot of folks struggling for, in this case, 75% of renters have a cost burden, meaning that they're paying 30%, more than 30% of their income in housing, and that makes them vulnerable. And the same pattern we see in Spokane. Spokane is a little bit higher. So for Spokane, 53.9% of households in 2022 were cost burden. And so that's definitely an issue when we talk about economic empowerment. So when we measure economic empowerment by looking at the living wage, education, housing, we are falling short both in the state and here in Spokane. So forecasting the future, we are not where we want to be nationally or in Washington, but we collectively are trying to make progress. We have a bright future ahead. Washington is the #1 economy in the nation, and that is something to be proud of. Spokane is thriving as the 2nd largest city in Washington. We have a diverse economy that includes service industries, wholesale and trade, medical industries, and entertainment. This includes a thriving sports industry. However, I want to reiterate that to create an inclusive economy, we must know how to measure the reality that we're living in. And that reality is that most Washingtonians cannot make ends meet, and we need to develop metrics to help us reach an empowerment line in Washington. Thank you for listening.
That's very good. Thank you very much. We are rolling up right into the lunch hour. You can give me just a bit of grace. I'd like to ask one question to wrap up the last our panelists. Move their presentation with precedent of the question. Then quite possibly during lunch, they might be, excuse me. I was thinking so prepared. This is happens just about every time. Really, the question has to do with the theme about, let's talk about equity. We know the pandemic disproportionately impacted women and people of color. Is there any data as to whether that's leveling? All final comments.
Sure, I can start a little bit with the industries that were impacted. When we look at some of the industries that were impacted to a great extent during the pandemic, a lot of these were industries that particularly have high proportions of their workforce are women or people of color, in particular in hospitality, as well as the healthcare industry that had very early losses that we have. Looking at some of the data as we were coming out of the pandemic, the unemployment insurance data told an interesting story, particularly in these industries. That was, we saw this surge of, especially when people of color showing up in the unemployment insurance roles. And as unemployment insurance, we saw the unemployment rate related, not the same thing, but similar trends. We saw the unemployment insurance data come down completely. And we saw, roughly the same number of women and our unemployment insurance now. Through it, it's no longer she's and that was really the case though, because when we looked at labor force participation, when we looked at which industries were still lagging behind, women were still disproportionately showing up. So there are some ways that we can see this in the data, but a lot of it isn't necessarily intuitive. We have to kind of dig beneath the surface and really be asking the questions: what is this data really telling me? Does it really tell the story that I think it's telling? The other thing that I would point out is something that I alluded to in the presentation, and that's when we're looking at some of the national statistics on the unemployment rate. We see some very, very stubborn patterns by gender, by race, by ethnicity. But during these moments when we have very low unemployment rates, that gap closes. And that's a really, I think those are opportunities. There's evidence, and there's hard numbers of that. So there's a lot of evidence that we see that. However, we depend when things return to higher unemployment. So I think it's figuring out. So yeah, I think that one thing to keep in mind is that these inequalities existed before the pandemic. So with the pandemic, they deepened, and so it is encouraging that the gap is, as Annalise mentioned. However, it still persists. The participation rate for women, particularly, and our person of color is greater, is still there. So as Annalise mentioned, it's very hard to understand why that is. So you have to dig deeper into the data, to look at data on, as I'm sure you've heard, right, childcare is emissions. The price of childcare is going through the roof. It's more, I know that when my kids were taking care, it was pretty much more than our mortgage. And so these are barriers for caregivers, particularly women, that prevent them from fully participating in the labor market, fully participating in the economy. And so we need to figure out ways in which we can eliminate or ease those barriers so that they can fully pursue their potential.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up child care. One thing around let's talk forward about child care. Thank you very much. I do want to thank you for your attention and your grace within 5 minutes. Definitely thank you, Dr. Ocasio-Cortez. Right. Yeah, right. Thank you. And Dr. Vince Sherman. Thank you. Right, that's also thank you if you have watched. We're at lunch, basic weathers, come on back into this room and we'll finish up the day. I'm sure you would mind having some questions people at home on the side. So enjoy your lunch. Oh, we got 5 minutes before the next session, so it's a grab and go. This is the start.